Okay, hi everyone. Good morning as well as good afternoon. My name is Candy. I am from APACMed. I am the manager of strategic partnerships, and I'll be doing a short introduction about APACMed before passing over to our esteemed moderator and panelists for this session. APACMed is the regional medtech trade association for Asia Pacific, and to date, we comprise close to 300 member companies representing manufacturers and suppliers of medical devices, IVDs, digital health providers, and other ecosystem stakeholders such as local trade associations, and all to bring a unifying voice to the industry here. More than half of our members now are startups. So this webinar, like others we have lined up, will be helping business leaders and partners learn how to grow and scale within Asia. Today, we'll be covering the future of in vitro diagnostics, and it is my pleasure to introduce the host of this webinar, Dr. Feras Mahdi, Head of MedTech APAC at IQVIA.
Thank you, Candy, for the kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining in. As Candy said, my name is Feras Mahdi. I'm the Senior Principal and Head of MedTech Consulting at IQVIA Asia Pacific, and will be your moderator for today's panel discussion, IVD 2.0, the Future of Diagnostics. It is my privilege to be joined on the virtual stage by 3 international experts in vitro diagnostics and high-tech engineering and design. Karel van Eijkeren, who is Business Manager for IVD Systems at Demcon, an international multi-industry high-tech development and engineering group. Karel studied electrical engineering at the University of Twente, followed by a master's focused on lab-on-chip applications. For the last 14 years, he has been working at the intersection of research, manufacturing, and life sciences, including work in advanced microchips, calcium sensors, fertility testing, and novel IVD diagnostics. Tze How Charn, who was initially slated for today, could not make it, but kindly filling in is Tom Wilshire, who's Vice President of Product Development at My Diagnostics, a medical devices company active in the development of new generation diagnostic platform for point-of-care testing based on disruptive nanofluidic semiconductor technology. Tom is a chartered mechanical engineer, holds a master's degree in mechanical and design engineering from the University of Newcastle upon Tyne, and is a fellow of the Institute of Mechanical Engineers. Prior to My Diagnostics, Tom was system development lead for a point-of-care diagnostic system with Quantumetics and led a global new product development team with National Oilwell Varco. Lastly, it is my distinct honor to welcome the Right Honorable Dr. Rudi Pauwels. Dr. Pauwels is a pharmaceutical scientist specialized in virology and micro and nanotechnology. Over a 35-year career in academia and industry, Rudi is the definition of a serial biotech entrepreneur, co-founding 9 companies, all of which have contributed immensely to the advancement of biotechnology and healthcare. To list just a few of Dr. Pauwels' contributions, he played a key role in the fight against AIDS pandemic by discovering several widely used anti-HIV drugs. This was during his doctorate studies at the Riga Institute in Belgium, and while leading his biotech company Tibotec that he co-founded in 1994. He also co-founded companies Verco Diagnostics in 1995, which focused on personalized HIV medicine, and BioCardis in 2007, which focuses on diagnostics related to infectious diseases and cancer. In 2017, after observing firsthand the front lines of the fight against Ebola, Rudi founded the Praesens Foundation to help address what he perceived as clear gaps in epidemic preparedness. I'm sure the global COVID pandemic has since amplified these quite a bit. He's also co-author of more than 150 papers and has received several awards, including the Global Technology Pioneer Award from the World Economic Forum in Davos in 2012, and an honorary doctorate degree from the University of Ghent in 2013. This is going to be an exciting discussion, and I look forward for all of you who are listening. Let me stop share. So to kick us off, I want to talk about, and this question is for Rudi. major mega technology trends in the diagnostic space, and maybe with a bit of focus on access, especially in the light of the COVID pandemic.
Hi, first, good afternoon, everybody. Pleasure to be here. Yeah, I think, like you point out, we're at a cross point in our industry, the diagnostic industry. And I think I maybe want to start first focusing on what has been driving our industry and then move to what are our challenges and also opportunities. Diagnostics since the dawn of medicine has been obviously always key. You can't really treat a disease if you don't have the proper diagnostics. And I think we've evolved from a more symptom-based trial by error type of approach in medicine to getting more a grip on the disease, underlying disease pathways of diseases, and including the causes of disease. So that has been fueling the trend in the last couple of years. And a very nice example of that is that last year, 17 what we call more precision medicine drugs were approved. I personally like more precision medicine over personalized medicine, but that's just a detail. And that was about 35% of all new chemical entities that were approved last year. So this is a trend that has been going on for a decade, and I think that is really driving innovation, because the more the research is going on the so-called biomarkers, the more that we can bring them into practice. Of course, there is always a tension or a gap or a lot of effort to do, which we'll talk about later today, on how to translate these research discoveries into real clinical practice. But I think what you say, Feras, is very important, and I recommend everybody to read in the Lancet of last October, the Lancet Commission paper on diagnostics. Which really is pointing and highlighting still the gaps that we have in our industry. It showed that barely 50%, 47% in that study of the global population has barely little or any access to diagnostics. And they looked at a number of indicator diseases like HIV, TB, and there the numbers vary, let's say from 35 to 65%. And of course, large parts of the population still don't have access. So that inequality, that poor access is really, I would say, the challenge for the coming years. And then of course, COVID-19 came along. And I think, which we all now witnessing, and it's really sobering to say. So the numbers are really staggering. We are now at half a billion people who have become infected, and that's the official number. 6.2 million deaths, and based on excess mortality and some other investigations, the IMF estimates that that it could be 2 to 4 times as big. So this is really staggering numbers. And it has been especially clear in the first few weeks, months of the COVID-19 outbreak that timely and accurate diagnostics is absolutely key. Because in a pandemic, you're always fighting two enemies, really. You fight a pathogen and then you find time. And you can't react upon if you don't have the information who is infected, who is not infected, how is the spread of the disease, and so forth. So I would say that diagnostics has been great in its progression on insights in diseases. Biomarkers are there driving our industry, but the key challenge, as illustrated unfortunately by the COVID outbreak, is really what can we do that large parts of the global population get access to diagnostics.
I think you touch upon, I think, again, this is something now everybody feels, even those, if you want, the lay people, felt there's a gap. Testing became the byword in the last 2 years. And that access gap, and it's a question for you, maybe Tom, to start off, what kind of implications might that have in the actual the innovation in the diagnostic world, especially since your company is also at that cusp, pioneering in this space?
Yeah, it is. Thanks. First, and I think so. Rudi summed up quite a few of the challenges that we face as a company making these diagnostic products, and what we saw was the opportunity to do these tests much faster than we're currently being offered. So particularly when, as Rudi mentioned, you've got the pathogen you're fighting, but also fighting time, a 48-hour, a 3-day turnaround for a result for a patient who thinks they maybe have an infectious disease and they're in a family potentially with other vulnerable people. It's not a great result. That's 3 days of potentially spreading that disease at work, at home, at other places. And so what we were trying to do is build a test which could do that in minutes. You could turn up to a GP and get a result within 15 minutes. You don't infect anyone else in that time. And that's really what we focused on as a company is taking a traditional, which is PCR is a traditional technique now, it's used very widely, but really trying to make it fit this sort of situation where you need a result in minutes to try to contain both pandemics and give people actionable information as soon as possible. And we really see that in our market research, in our speaking with the places that use these instruments has been a real key driver for getting diagnostics in the hands of people.
Brilliant. So speed being that one of the key elements here.
That's it. And sorry, go on.
No, and Karel, I was wondering if you had any thoughts in addition to speed. What could support?
Yeah, in addition to speed, what we see at Demcon is that we see a couple of trends. One is automation of diagnostics, and automation is key to, of course, increase speed, but also to minimize operator hand-on time and reduce operator error, and thereby making the diagnostics more accessible and more reliable to and more cheaper, of course, to people. And of course, the second trend is indeed point of care or home use. So it's indeed also a kind of automation of typical lab procedures, but then at your home. And this enables, of course, monitoring diseases and enables early detection as well. So there are two trends: automation, the lab, and bringing the lab to the home or to the general practitioner.
Brilliant. Now, connectivity again. So I understand that connectivity now is all the rage. The Internet of Medical Things is clear. The power of data is growing. Tom, you actually work in built-in connectivity in some of the products that you have. Could you comment on that as a trend as well?
Absolutely. And I suppose that the fundamental driver of that is that doing the test is one thing. So doing a super fast PCR isn't much use if that data isn't actionable. It needs to be somewhere where it can be used to improve a patient's outcome. So there's sort of two sides to it. There is a requirement to get that information somewhere useful, so to get it into a central place to be able to produce an official result. So if we think about the COVID travel situation, maybe an interesting one where I'm sure if anyone has tried to travel in the last 2 years, you'll have been at the airport where people are required to do a series of tests or evidence of tests, and maybe turning up with photographs of lateral flow tests, or expecting there to be some sort of central place where if you're taking a test somewhere in the world that every airport will know, and that's not the case, and it causes enormous lines. And so we're really working on trying to find the most useful place to send our data once we've done it. The other side, of course, of that is you're handling very, very sensitive data. You are handling data which is private. There are very, very strict rules in place about how you handle that data. And so balancing that, those two sides, trying to make the data as useful as possible while respecting the laws and, of course, the ethics of handling that data is very, very difficult. We spend at least, I would say, half of our effort in that side of things. It's making the product and making the results is one part, but actually handling that data and making it as useful as possible is a huge part of the work that we do, and it's very difficult. It's definitely a challenge.
I think integrating data is always going to be a challenge, but there have been strides. Now, for argument's sake, and the assumption here, and questions for you, Rudi, we get all this data, we connect it, we bring it, in a meaningful, structured format. Then what do we do with it? And what's the opportunity here, and maybe what's the challenge even?
Well, again, COVID-19 is illuminating on that aspect. And there was such a massive need for testing that and cheap testing, especially in the low and middle income countries where we had clearly challenges in scaling up PCR-based systems. So there was a trend to go to rapid lateral flow type of test. You know, they're rapid, they're fast, they also got better along the way. But like you point out, a vast majority of that data could not escalate up to the higher level. And on top of what Tom's just mentioned, I would define two levels of data utility. There is the first order problem, meaning what do you do with the patient? Do you isolate, do you treat, etc. But COVID-19 and in general infectious diseases, especially surveillance, outbreak, rapid response, that information really is proving critical. How can you expect authorities to impose certain measurements, countermeasures, if you don't even know what is happening in the population? You see that in the numbers, for instance, in the beginning. The virus, in retrospect, probably went around SARS-CoV-2 then in 4 to 6 weeks. But in larger parts of the world, in fact, the majority of the world, it just didn't go, it was not detected. So I think the first really utility in that second order space for us is pathogen presence, characterization, analysis. Where is something coming from? I illustrate also with a non-COVID example. So there was last year an outbreak of Ebola in Guinea. And this has happened more than a dozen times in the last 40 years. But what was very specific is that once we started sequencing that particular strain, we discovered that that was a case coming from a patient that survived the Ebola outbreak in 2015. So this was the first worldwide case of a kind of latent infection of Ebola, which would lead immediately to make sure that sexual transmission and so on countermeasure was made. So I think we can do much more with that information, and I refer often to what we do in climate modeling, what we do in weather prediction, what we do in other risk areas, traffic control, you name it, pollution monitoring. We have not really seen that in let's say, infectious diseases and pandemics. Also AMR, antimicrobial resistance, which is a massive problem. We had the UK report a few years ago highlighting to the importance of that, but again, data is driving those insights and more importantly is driving those things. The challenge we have a little bit, Feras, is that we've seen this also with several outbreaks, also with COVID, that sometimes countries, regions can be a bit reluctant to share that information because all kinds of reasons, economical reasons. But I think what COVID shows is that a problem in one part of the world can become a problem in every part of the world. So there needs to be mechanisms, we and other colleagues are working on that. International organizations around the world is how can we make that spread of infectious diseases information more readily available, identify new trends, new mutations, etc. So I think standardization, legal requirements, patient confidentiality, all these things we know are challenges, but I would say can be overcome. I don't think it's a technology. There is no, technology is there. It's now the political will and the agreements to implement those, and also encourage young innovators, young companies and established companies to agree on some kind of standards. This also posed a problem in the last 24 months. One system was not the other. So the very minimum is that these systems need to be able to talk to each other. And then not to be forgotten, again, taking the position from many parts of the world where, we take internet access for granted. So in terms of innovation, technology per se, I want to point out that it's always wise to have some local data processing. And then, of course, when connectivity can be established, then the data, and it's a little practical thing, but also that sometimes is underestimated in terms of where you are in the world when you implement those solutions.
Couldn't agree more. I wanted to follow up. question here. That's the ideal, getting everything together. And then we've gone through this pandemic. Have there been some pockets of success in getting some bits of data and using it effectively? Or do you feel that we're still at a very nascent stage?
No, I think the glass is definitely more than half full. If you compare, as you grow older a little bit, you can benchmark with earlier outbreaks. Let's say in the 80s, of course, it was HIV and then hepatitis C, and so we had Zika, Ebola, many others, most of which never make the media. So I do see really progress on that front, on many fronts. But that's also going to be needed, because these outbreaks are not just a matter of when they're going or if they're going to occur. It's just when. And we see in worldwide analysis of outbreaks a clear trend to increase it. So yes, we have progress, but we can do better. And again, if I would compare with other challenges that a global society faces in other aspects, I just mentioned a few. I think we can get inspired and learn from that to implement similar measures. But all of us have seen. I mentioned GIS8, which is a very nice. This is more on sequence information. So there have been really good efforts. It's a matter now to make sure that they're consistent, that there are interfaces, that there is some kind of standardization, and that some international organizations, like they are doing here and there with various degrees of success, to bring it all together. Can be done, and so there's no reason why the next time we cannot be better prepared than that.
Adding to that, Rudi, what we see here at Demcon as we work for various companies is that connectivity is now basically a kind of standard that's incorporated into new developments for products. Almost everything is connecting with a mobile phone or with the internet. Even sometimes that the algorithm analyzing the raw measurement data is running into the cloud. So we're getting there. Although the standards, that's perhaps something that needs more attention, but at least the connectivity is there.
Yeah, I mean, definitely it's a theme. The amount of data, I work at IQVIA, which is the human data science company, the 52 petabytes and counting of just generated medical data. Interoperability, I think the standardization you guys mentioned, and the baseline connectivity. This is no longer a nice to have. I think you hit on the dot. It's a must have. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, maybe one thing I would like to add in terms of utility of the data, it is not just the data of the result itself, which then can be deeper analyzed. It's also the contextual data that is showing in a number of cases very valuable. And I give an example. So knowing, for instance, when in what kind of clinical status the patient is at the moment that the diagnosis is made, really helps very rapidly worldwide to understand, what is the asymptomatic phase, how is transmission occurring, how efficient are the countermeasures, urbanization areas. So things which again in other areas we overlay various data layers and come to let's say much more deeper and very excitingly more predictive modeling exercises, which again from a public health point of view and a countermeasure point of view in outbreaks and pandemics is absolutely life-saving. So it's more than just let's say the data of the result. And another point of data connectivity, especially as we see an increase in the sample to result point of care diagnostic systems, we should not remember those systems are in a setting with potentially less calibrations and controls. So that remote serviceability, automatic updates, things we are so accustomed to in other fields, in smartphones, we all take it, we don't even think about it anymore. This is something that only in the bigger system, it has been around for a while in the big centralized systems, but bringing that also to point of care, I think is also important, so that the systems that we place in these decentralized systems also keep operating. There are challenges sometimes that there is, an upgrade to be made, and then a service engineer has to go. So there's technology there that can do that. So it's all along a wide spectrum of aspects that data digitalization is just a must, and we can do much more if we have more of these layers of data. Absolutely.
Agree. I mean, in digital trials and trolling data for information that can help approvals. Now, that is something I'd like to talk about as well. And maybe Karel, you could comment on this. We have the product now. Now, getting it to market, not just from the design point of view, but getting it certified, approved to enter a market, it needs evidence, it needs data information. Do you think a data revolution has any way could impact this from a speed or efficiency point of view?
Yeah, absolutely. So when you start developing a new product, there's almost no data available at all. And you need, during your development, even before approval, during your development, you would like to know if you're on the right track. You need data to make the right and good development decisions. So there are a couple of tricks you can use. Simulation is one of them. So for instance, finite element modeling can help getting more insights in your system. For instance, fluidic behavior or heat transfer between various components. You can really well simulate that, and you can use those simulation results to as a kind of evidence that you're on the right track with your design. Something rather new that we see is happening is, for instance, artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence, AI, you need a large data set to train your algorithm. And sometimes this data set is not available, or very specific situations are not available. Here at Demcon, we also have a visualization studio, and what they did was rather, I think, amazing, is to make synthetic data. So they made visualizations, renders of certain environments to train the AI for those specific circumstances. So you can also generate data without having the real data on hand. Of course, you need to verify your system in the end, and also do clinical trials. This is with a limited set of products available. So you really need to be aware of what you are measuring and how you're measuring it. And you could also use not your real system, but also sometimes mock-ups, for instance, to simulate user handling and use flow. So there are all kinds of aspects you can use in your design, during your design process, to generate as much data as possible to help getting to market fast.
I mean, I've worked in AI a bit, and that was a critical step, just getting all the data there and just harvesting it as a baseline. The idea that you're simulating the data in vitro, if you want.
Sure. You generate the data instead of harvesting it, so to say. You generate by simulation the right environments to feed to your AI system.
So Tom, for you, and you're developing a product, in terms of the regulations and regulatory, have you been able to leverage any of this kind of data in that process? And I know we have a question from the audience specifically around regulatory landscape, but maybe pertaining to what your own experience is.
So absolutely. So I suppose there's two things I think it'd be good to touch on about the AI. So one is on the development of our algorithmic and our decision sort of making system, but we've also leveraged it quite heavily in the manufacturing, to reduce costs, to make lots of these units to get them into the field. But for the regulatory side of things, we run a very tight timeline. The product that we will launch is focused on a pandemic. It's a COVID product, and so we tried to get through the whole verification, the validation of the system as soon as possible. So what we used AI for in terms of regulatory approach was to make sure we did simulated trials way ahead of doing our formal validation studies, which would go into our submission to the regulatory body. What we wanted to do is we wanted to do that in one shot. We didn't want to go to a clinic, run some trials, get some feedback, make some changes, do it again and again. We used AI there to generate data, to generate noise as well, to put into our system to see how it handled a real world environment. We know that when we go from taking our system in our lab by our users who have used it for thousands of hours and then put it in the hands of somebody else, it's not a like for like comparison. You have new users who will do new things and do things in ways that you've never thought of. So what we tried to do is simulate some of that upfront, run trials internally, but introducing errors essentially artificially to gather that body of data, solve those problems early, so that when we did go to our formal regulatory validation, we were ready and we could go through it in one hit to reduce that overall time it takes to get a product from the lab into the market. And it worked great for us. It's an approach that we took a lot of time over, but had some really good results from.
I mean, this is
add to this, so I cannot agree more. So what we typically do is indeed make the core technology available early on in the design process. We call that the functional model, and you could use that indeed to already generate early on in your development, critical data.
You know, I think Rudi had mentioned this at the beginning, that you're in a race against time, and anything that can save time is obviously welcome. This seems to be a very, very efficient way of doing things. Now, maybe I want to just shift tack just a bit. We talked about the trends. Now, maybe go a bit technical. What, in your view, and this question is I'll start with you, Karel, some emerging technologies that might expand or accelerate the applications of IVD diagnostics, the in-vitro diagnostics?
Yeah, one of those key technologies is, of course, microfluidics, lab-on-a-chip technology. Although it's well known around the world, it's really a new kind of technology still. It's not that major as, for instance, electronics. And therefore, developing applications around microfluidics is still posing some challenges, as we still do not know how it exactly behaves. There's still a lot to learn. And what we see is that a lot of companies we work with at Demcon are using, of course, microfluidics, as it is key to bring fast to the market and close to the patient the diagnostic technology. So how to handle this, and that is key if it's not major technology or new technology, is that you learn fast, and doing that by an iterative way of designing. So start with some simple tests first to de-risk your system. Work with, of course, knowledgeable people. So that's really key. For instance, like Tom mentioned, have available a system. So we call that a functional model. It's not a real product, but it's the key technology. Make that available very fast and learn from that. And from that part, tune and build your further development around. And so, yeah, microfluidics is still, of course, we see it a lot. But there are not so many products around yet. It's now kind of emerging. So it's, you need a major technology. That takes time.
Rudi, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I just want to echo. We've been for more than 2 decades in lab on a chip. We've got all the journals, and so it's hardly something new. But what the last 2 decades have shown is that there is a huge gap between, let's say, early prototypes, proof of concepts, and then turning into real product. And outside the typical challenges with microfluidics, everybody knows the air bubbles and the control of the liquids, et cetera, et cetera. I would flag two areas where let's say innovation has proven much more difficult. One is sample prep, which is, and I'm talking, how do you deal with a swap? Just look at COVID. I think you can count on one hand the number of point sample to result system that can actually handle a swap. let alone feces samples, which was some of the things I worked on in the past. So this is not very flashy, but it is the reality on the ground. You have potentially very infectious sample, very messy, very heterogeneous, especially in disease states. And whereas microfluidics is something that works relatively well with clean liquids, but once you get into that messy area, that's proven much more. So I would say that is one area where some solutions are being worked on. First products are on the market, but much more needs to be done. The second thing is actually not so much with the technology per se, which has kept on improving impressively the last few years. Maybe Tom, you can mention a few things of that, what your company is doing. But I would say the key challenge, which we also seen in the COVID outbreak, is how to scale in manufacturing. And what with manufacturing is not just making more of it. It's ensuring that you have sufficient yields, the quality is right, that you also bring in the reagents. We should not forget many of these reagents can be potentially thermolabile. And again, if you go into very remote settings or in climate zones with higher temperatures, shelf life, preferably the absence of a cold chain storage, are all product requirements that may not have to do directly with how good or well your microfluidic system works, but you need to bring the reagents in, potentially the enzymes and so on. So scaling that up at a massive scale is something that I would say for younger innovators and companies around the call now, take those considerations, requirements, think them through right from the start. So in the beginning, of course, like Karel mentioned, you iterate very fast, you learn very, very quickly, preferably, but you have to bring those things into consideration. So I want to flag those two. So sample prep and upscale of manufacturing. With another point is that, which COVID bit painfully illustrated, is that when you take on a global scale, we have very, very little, let's say, regional manufacturing. So the tendency, if you think about manufacturing, is make your huge manufacturing plant and get scaled there. But we have seen that the supply chains, there was really some supply chain issues worldwide. So I would say, think also about scalability of your manufacturing concepts, which is like a second level of thinking.
Rudi, to build on this, and you're taking us down the path of what to think of as an innovator. And, you're all innovators in one way or form. Rudi, you've done 9 companies. Moving something from the lab bench into the real world, what do you think are some key success factors?
You have to think backwards. What I mean with that is when you're sitting with your team, and of course, the tendency is to focus on the technical challenge of the day, is to keep the team extremely informed, motivated, inspired by how that product ultimately will need to be deployed, need to be shipped, need to be deployed, need to be used by your end customers. That is absolutely important. I just mentioned manufacturing. So bringing that, this is why I mentioned backward thinking. It's thinking, let's say, to a point in the future where you want to have scale. Don't underestimate cost too, which is another impediment for global adoption of diagnostics, is often the cost, which we need to bring down through scale, through innovation. So bring all those parameters right into the innovation cycles, as Tom and Karel mentioned, and make sure that because these teams are very multidisciplinary. And so you've got chemists and biologists and engineers and informaticians all working together, which if it works, it can be magic. But you have to make sure that those final objectives, technological objectives, product specification objectives are incorporated throughout the process extensively. I give one example. I've seen products fail because the entire design cycle was too much driven by, they were running samples, but these were spiked samples, for instance. relatively healthy patients. And then when the first disease samples came in, some of the filtration systems had to be redesigned. These are examples that probably other colleagues in the field can also share with when they look back at what they've done in the past, where if you do it again, you would think about that much more, and especially sooner rather than later. Because once you're in what we call a design freeze of an innovation program, any changes thereafter are very costly, very timely. So you rather make maybe the mistakes and the hard lessons learned earlier on in the program rather than later, because then it can be a challenge.
Related to that, Rudi, I can just only agree, of course. So make the design choices as soon as possible, and making the step from a lab setup towards a product is a big one, and a lot is still unknown. And a lot of your assay or your product could be improved. And what we typically see here at Demcon is that when we're working with customers who have a question for a design for us, that we're asking questions, and we need to present them with a budget and a timeline and a scope, etc. So that makes it really clear what we are going to do, and it's forcing customers who want a design to make choices as well. And so they get out of the research phase, so to say. Everything can be nicer and quicker and better performing. However, you need to make the step towards a real product. And by bringing in focus and showing the consequences if you want to change something, of course it can be done, but it will add to the time to market. It will add to your development costs. Forcing those choices is really key, and typically you see that customers are quicker to market when working with an external party or perhaps an internal organization, forcing those decisions.
For me, it does another really important thing as well. So working back from a successful outcome and looking at those plans is making these products is hard. You're doing something new. You're doing something that you can't just go and look up the answer normally, and you will get things wrong, and the team will get demoralized. There'll be dark times in any development, but having that goal in mind really helps. It's okay to fail. We're just looking at the next way to make it work. And for me, and motivating a team of engineers and scientists here, that's really important, that we remember that you can take a step back and say, okay, well, we've actually come quite far, and that problem is just a temporary problem. We'll solve it, and you really can, particularly when you've got complex, multidisciplinary projects, use that final goal as something which is very motivating. I find it's really important that we keep that in mind, and we talk about it most weeks here, about the problem we're actually trying to solve is improving people's lives, and then those problems become a little bit smaller if your experiment fails, or if your piece of metal bends the wrong way. They become more manageable to tackle, and that's another huge side of working backwards that works well for us.
Yeah, so I think the fail fast is key here, and we're doing that with a risk-based approach. So look at the risks, technical risks, the difficulties you have in your design. You're not sure of if it is going to work, and try to prove those concepts that you came up with. First, fail, improve, and then start building your towards a design freeze.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. The timeline from concept to design to product and into the market, let's say in medtech, is much faster than pharma, but would take a good 3 to 5 years. I think over the pandemic, things have accelerated, and people need to adjust to this timeline. And that what you guys are saying about a design freeze, rather than paralysis by perfection, I can do an increment, I can do an add-on. It's really important to remain, salient and relevant, especially things are moving very quickly. Do you have some other, and Karel, this is a question for you. What other elements does somebody want to take into consideration from the get-go? As you're designing. Now, I understand the design freeze, but when you're thinking about the design, you mentioned business requirements. What other things could you think of?
Yeah, there are a couple of things, of course. So first is have those technical risks in mind, tackle those first. Keep your business case in mind. So what, especially for disposables, what are the allowed costs, and put that into your requirements of your product. And then work towards a set of requirements that you can freeze first. For the requirements, of course, technical requirements, business requirements, and also manufacturing requirements. Design for manufacturing, design for test, your supply chain are all important key factors contributing to a successful product. After you have those requirements set and then work towards, of course, regulatory aspects, standards, safety, operator risk, patient risk, all those standards, it's all in the first phase of your product. Taking into account in your requirements, you come up with a concept that you can then detail further out. So a lot of work needs to be done in this preparation phase, so to say. We call it the product requirements phase. Yeah.
Tom, do you have any? Now you're in the middle of it, and you're bringing your product to market. Anything resonates?
Yes, absolutely. So that requirements phase is absolutely vital, and we actually call it here like a requirements negotiation, because you will have many conflicting things at the start of the project. There'll be the markets that want it incredibly fast, incredibly cheap, or there'll be other markets that want it incredibly robust. You have to take all these things into consideration and start to develop the sort of the product that works best for you and your market. So that requirements phase is very, very often underestimated. That should take a long period of time, and it should be something which evolves with the project as well. It is where, and we work with companies like Demcon and other companies who can get frustrated by that. They want a decision, they want a thing which is, yeah, please help us make this thing. And we find that some of those being comfortable trying to make those calls without having all the information there, it's been very, very important. You are, it's a big role here. We have a systems team who essentially specialize in making calls without having every single piece of information, and not everyone's comfortable with that. But we find that's a really vital step in getting something from a lab bench into a practical product which is in the market. It's a huge part for what we do, that front end of nailing down exactly what the product is.
Rudi, you wanted to say something?
Yeah. I want to complement by maybe make a few observations, again, looking at the last couple of years, various other outbreaks. What we have to be also careful about, and what I also see as a trend in the COVID-19, is the following. We tended in the past to go from crisis to crisis. So you saw a flurry of new systems against Zika or Ebola. And unfortunately, this was also published a couple of years later. Many of these systems then disappear. And the other aspect of it, if you look at what really worked in the last 24 months in terms of addressing the needs globally of COVID-19, is the strength and power of platform technologies. It's when you mentioned, Feras, about the speed to develop an assay. Tommy's My Diagnostics is in a special situation that it's a new platform and a first assay, so it's all new at the same time. It's quite challenging, and they should be congratulated for trying to do that. But it's in reality, are the companies who had already established platforms who then had to focus on how fast can we develop the assay. And the biological component is also not to be underestimated. The better the quality of, for instance, the pathogen sequence information, and I'm not just mentioning the reference sequence that pops up in the beginning of an outbreak, which can be the reference sequence or just can be, let's say, just a sample. It's very important that those people in the teams who design the biologic part of the assay get the correct information. But then come back on the scaling, which I had to, we discussed this in the international community on how fast can we scale. Many people are unaware or not fully appreciate how much time it takes to build a manufacturing capacity. We already mentioned that. And it's just not like, in a twin that you design a fully automated manufacturing line. So I think in our industry, we have to think beyond, let's say, the one assay, but think platform, so that also in the interest of the company, of course, is that you can bring very quickly and sufficient menu. A challenge for many diagnostic companies is after finishing the technology, is then have a very oiled machine, very efficient machine to start producing the content. Otherwise, it's a bit of a one-off. And in that sense, I think in terms of other innovation opportunities, I think we've seen now a flurry of, let's say, COVID-19 rapid tests, various platforms, various technologies. But we should not forget that infectious diseases, the syndromes that we're all talking about, respiratory symptoms or gastrointestinal or tropical fevers, can be caused by a multitude of different viruses and bacteria. So if it's then not COVID, is it an influenza, RSV? If it's not HIV, or is it not malaria? What is it then? And so, in reality, you see worldwide that still a lot of patients, once the most obvious culprit is not being identified either clinically or via point-of-care rapid test, that we still not know how many of those what pathogens are. So therefore, I see also a good future for multiplexing. And obviously, one other innovation that we haven't talked about is next generation sequencing, which is evolving, fortunately, like it has done in cancer, from, let's say, the realm of describing, let's say, and characterizing pathogens, which, as we all know, has gone through a tremendous evolution. But also here, we have the same gap. How do we translate now that incredible advances in technology in something that we can use clinically useful, maybe as a second line test in case the rapid test doesn't provide an adequate answer, and definitely in surveillance. So I see there newer trends, new opportunities to bring next generation sequencing based characterization absolutely to the clinical world as one of the next big steps to execute in our industry.
I would like just to ask, so I'm going to take a question from the audience, which is maybe pertinent to what you just mentioned, Rudi. The point of care testing and packaging a lot of this in a way that's maybe not hospital-based, not hugely cumbersome. The question is about, this improves infrastructure. What are the barriers, especially in the, let's say, less privileged parts of the world, to get that kind of infrastructure installed and integrated into their existing healthcare systems?
Yeah, I had the fortune to work with our Praesens team on many missions in Africa. So yeah, I encourage everybody, if they're thinking about this problem, to actually make such trips, because the reality on the ground is very illuminating. I think, although point of care testing and small system look small, and everybody expect them to be cheap, actually the design requirements in terms of robustness, resilience, autonomy needs, it's actually much more complex than what we perceive as the high-end diagnostic systems that are typically seen in large laboratories. So I would say the key feature is that you have to, we just can't fill that huge global gap by copying the model that has worked in some parts of the world, especially the developed worlds. I mean, the need for training of operators and technicians is just unrealistic. This means that I think the trend to have easy to use, easy to maintain, easy to ship, cost-effective, preferably lower cost, which I think you can massively achieve, like smartphones, through massive scaling of production, is the way to go. And secondly, I also believe, Karel mentioned already automation, but I think we can move to different types of automation where maybe we can create some kind of point of care lab. So a miniature version of the larger centralized systems, because in contrast to what we often believe, when you're in a small village somewhere in the world, they don't have just a TB problem or an HIV problem or a malaria problem. They get sick from lots of things. And so we tend to fund and solve these problems like one disease at a time, whereas we have to take really the patient perspective, the community perspective, and say, okay, there's maybe no electricity. I give you an example. How do you expect to have interconnectivity if you don't even have reliable, high quality electricity? The spikes in the electrical grid can be enormous, and explains why many of these otherwise well-designed systems start to fail because of the spikes in the electrical grid. So these are, let's say, reality elements on the ground that have to channel back to innovation. So we have to assume that you can't have the workforce. The systems have to be more resilient, more rugged, more not rugged, but have to be more stronger to cope with the operations. It's a little bit like, you know, when you go to Mars, you have to think about all those things as well. So I think we have to take a little bit that vision, and then we can get disruptive innovation, which, by the way, is not just for low and middle income countries. The reality on the ground in many of in the developed world is that, give the example, more than 50–60% of cancer patients have to travel a couple of hours before they can go to a cancer center. So I don't think we have to divide the world up by, let's say, low and middle income countries and developed ones. The need for diagnostics is everywhere, also in our urban areas, as unfortunately, again, COVID-19 kind of illustrated.
Just a really quick add on that, Rudi mentioned it a lot. Go to the look at the actual use and the persons who are going to use. Why do they want to use the system? Do they understand the use of the system? Do they have the money or to buy this system? So yeah, really go to the persons who are going to use the system, and that is key.
This is insightful. I mean, I guess from the front lines, it's really important, that reality check that sometimes we work in a lab, design it as such, and then reality hits, and then you have a very different context. You know, we're reaching the top of the hour, and this has been very illuminating. And we have a lot of innovators also on the call. So I will go in order, Karel, Tom, and then closing with Rudi. Just some brief words of wisdom to the innovators out there. Just, you know, closing remarks and thoughts.
Yeah, some closing remarks from my side is really have a realistic planning, do the risk-based approach. You have to cut sometimes some corners, but be very aware of those, because they will hit you back at the further development phase, and then you have to spend a lot of time and money to repair something caused in the beginning of a development phase.
Tom, over to you.
So I suppose my main piece of advice would be just to recognize this is not easy. This is not something which the answers are already available for. This will be things that you're trying to do something fantastic and life altering, and so there will be some times when it doesn't work first time. And my advice would be just to keep going. If I were to count up the number of times my projects have or experiments have failed over the years, it would be in the hundreds. But you solve them one at a time, and eventually you get there. So my advice would be to keep going. It's difficult, but it is absolutely worth it.
Brilliant. Rudi?
Hi. Yeah, I have two audiences in mind now when you ask me that question. The first one, to the innovators. You are at a crossroad in our industry. And I know as innovator, the first thing you do is what is out there and how can make a difference. And it can be very intimidating. But as I try to explain at a few occasions here, half of the world population doesn't have any or little access to diagnostics. That is your opportunity. Of course, and try to innovate from that point of view. You know, with all the conditions that Karel and Tom also mentioned, you know, execute well, because a vision without an execution is an hallucination. So I think that's really key. The second thing, which our entire industry has been suffering a little bit from, is the perceived value gap of diagnostics. I could see this in COVID-19. There were massive funds for vaccines, rightfully so. It was needed. Still took a year to get there, which is the elephant in the room. Virus goes in 4 to 6 weeks, yet it took a year to get the first vaccine, also working on that. There was some therapy, but diagnostics has to be cheap. And so a lot of my colleagues in the field have been trying to reach back to donors and stakeholders and ask the question, because this is not over. COVID-19 has a 2% mortality case fatality ratio. The other coronavirus, SARS, at 10%, MERS 35%. So I let it open to the imagination of everybody. What would have happened in the last 2 years if we had a COVID-19 that was 5 to 6, 7 times more mortal than this? That leaves little for imagination. But the question is not, can we afford diagnostics? Which is the thing, you know, the race down to the single digit dollar question. I looked it up, and the International Monetary Fund predicts that the total global cost of the COVID-19 through 2024 will be more than $12.5 trillion. So I'd like to end answering those and say the question is not, can we afford diagnostics? The question is, can we afford not to invest in diagnostics and be prepared for the next time, which is just a matter of time.
Wise words, and I thank you all. I've learned a lot. I've enjoyed the discussion immensely. I thank you, APACMed, for organizing, and of course, I thank everybody for tuning in. Until next time, thanks everybody.
Thank you very much.
So,
Bye.
Bye-bye.